But let's assume that the people on the commission and Mary Lou Setters and Charlie Baker are going to listen to this podcast. Is there anything you'd want them to know?
Oh boy, yeah. That's a loaded question.
Okay, well we can all pass.
No, I don't think it's I think it's more.
That's a hard one to answer within.
Explosion.
Okay, welcome to Buds with Suds. I am Richard Zombeck, and I'm here with my co-host Steve Lesnikowski.
Yep, still here.
Yeah, I know. We're still doing this. We have a couple guests on the podcast today, and just before that, I want to do a couple housekeeping items just to remind you all to subscribe to us on iTunes. Make sure you like us, and you can find all of our links at www.budswithsuds.com. That'll get you to our Facebook page, LinkedIn, Twitter, and all of the outlets that we're on. So that's like, what are we on now? Spotify and iTunes and all kinds of stuff. Google Play and all that kind of stuff. So and YouTube, yeah. Thanks, Dennis. So while since Dennis decided to pipe up here, we've got Dennis Doris and Danny Ginivan. They're both recovery coaches on the North Shore. Working in the quote unquote field, certifiable too, and Danny's also a recovery coach supervisor at a large facility on the North Shore as well.
Local nonprofit. So one of the reasons, well, there are a couple of reasons why I wanted to have you guys on. Was one, the three of you along with Steve and Danny and Dennis went up to Fall River. To Governor Baker's Commission on Recovery Coaching, the listening session up there. So, Steve, why don't since you're the co-host, why don't you start us out on this?
So, I mean, it essentially was a process that Mary Lou Sutters and her commission, and how many people? There's 22 people on their commission.
There are 14 that we know of. Right. One that will be reappointed because they stepped down or were asked to step down. It's not really clear.
Okay.
And Mary Lou Sutters is?
Oh, I'm sorry. She's the Secretary of Health and Human Services in the state of Massachusetts. So they're basically doing a tour around the state to collect people's input, suggestions, what they think should happen. And this was the first of four or five sessions, I believe. Five. Okay.
And they're going to do these all over the state?
Correct. Yeah, they are going to do, the next one is in Worcester. After Worcester, they are going to Haverhill, and then Greenfield, and then one in Cape Cod. They don't have firm dates on these. They have the week of, as of right now. It's all posted on if you Google Recovery Coach Commission from Massachusetts, you can get all that information specifically.
Right. So Danny, just for the people listening, what exactly happens at a listening session?
As many commission members as possible can kind of show up there and listen, and they're there to hear from the public what people's thoughts are about recovery coaching in general. They have some topics that they like the people that are speaking to give testimony for, specifically that they want to hear about. Some people followed that, other people didn't. And, it's just for them to hear from the public the general consensus about recovery coaching in the state.
And is that something you can just show up for, or do you have to? Absolutely.
I showed up, I signed up, I spoke, I got my 3 minutes. I plan on doing it at every one. You are able to, they don't check IDs, nothing. You can show up and you get your 3 minutes, and you could kind of say whatever you wanted or felt. It wasn't very censored, or nobody really only one person got cut off, and that's because I think it was really early in the commission, so they were worried about getting everybody through to speak. But, I mean, you get your 3 minutes of sharing your opinion on this.
Okay. Go ahead, Steve. I think I interrupted you, so.
I mean, you pretty much we covered what we need to cover, but I mean, it's been a process, and I feel like the point of this commission, right? It was written into the laws that were passed a few years ago by Governor Baker. They're basically going to set forth what the credentialing outline is going to be for the state moving forward, right? Because we have sort of a shoestring certification process, right? I believe the quote that Dennis used was a ham sandwich could be certified as a recovery coach at this point. So it looks like they're collecting a lot of information about how trainings are done, what the compensation is, what our caseload looks like.
Peer load.
Payload, yeah. So
Get out.
the training.
Get out.
So the training system, as it is right now, is certainly open. It's a free for all right now, in my opinion. And yes, I hope the state does do something as far as stepping in and making it easier. Because as of right now, I mean, you can do it outside of BSAS pretty much. You can do the whole process, the
Sure.
training process outside of BSAS, and it's not. There's no oversight on it. Anybody can get trained,
Right.
and getting hired right now is not very hard.
Well, when you say making it easier, do you mean getting the certification easier, or, I mean, what exactly does that apply to?
What's that as far as?
Well, you said making it easier.
So the state, the commission states in their mission that they want to create a streamlined process to getting credentialed. So to you and I, streamlined means faster and easier. I hope they don't make it faster and easier, but I think it's pretty fast and easy right now. I think that's creating some of the problems we see and things like that. So I would like it if they kept it in one, like when BSAS was doing it, it was kind of more easy for them to vet people, that type of stuff, keep track of who was being trained, things like that. Right now, that's not so much the case. So I would like to see, as much as I don't like government doing things, I would like to see the state kind of step in and kind of be, training people or whatever,
Danny, you had something to add to that?
Yeah, I think the biggest thing that got taken away is like you can there's places that will do a recovery coach academy for someone that just walked out of detox, and I'm not sure that every person that just walks out of detox is it's the right fit to start professionally working as a recovery coach or
Right, but
starting on that path.
But for right now, though, the qualifications are, there's still 60 hours of classes, right, that you have to pay for out of pocket for the most part, depending on the agency you're working with. I mean, you could be working for an agency that will reimburse you for the fees, but there's still 60 hours of class time. There's, 500 hours of practical time, and then something like 32 hours of supervision time, right?
Correct.
So, I mean, that's, for the most part, could be enough to keep people from finishing, right? If they're really not motivated to be a recovery coach, for example, right? Or at least within the 30 hours or the first 30 hours of that to say, well, I don't know if I want to keep going. This really isn't for me. You don't think that's enough, or do you think there should be more that the state would actually make it a little more difficult to complete, or should the hoop be wider and allow more people in?
So my thing is this: you have 1,200 people that took the academy, right? Only 80 of those people are certified in the state. But that certification with employers, I mean, most employers you might get a little bump, but it's not like you have to be a certified coach to get hired. No one's implemented that. Like, some places say you have to be a LADAC to work, so you have to be this, you have to be a licensed. So, there's no standard for recovery coaches. You have to have your CARC before we hire you. I don't know of any place that has a firm set policy that says we only hire recovery coaches that are certified in the state.
Well, no, what they'll say is you have to get it within 12 months.
Okay.
So, yeah, I mean, there's places that are doing that, but it's not uniform.
No.
Right, so there's no uniform licensing procedure like there is for social workers and mental health counselors, and so.
So what do you guys think? Do you think that that what the governor's putting together is potentially a good thing then? I mean, that's kind of the sense I'm getting from all of you.
Well, to answer your question, being smaller or bigger, I think the way we got certified, where trainings were, we had to kind of chase our training, like go all over the state and things like that.
Yeah.
I mean, it wasn't great, but I mean, you could get all your trainings in 10 days right now. And I don't think, I would like to see more of a period where maybe somebody could wash out, somebody that isn't ready to become a coach, has to put in a little work to get trained.
Yeah,
and
so
maybe go, this isn't for me.
So it's interesting because there are two weeks of classes available at North Shore Community College right up the street, right? You can take the first 30 hours in 1 week and then the second 30 hours in the next week. And one of the guests we had on the last episode of the podcast, Mark Kennard, was talking about that his role actually was basically talking people out of getting certain degrees because he didn't feel that they were qualified to do the work, right? So something like Danny said, that you have people who are just coming out of detox and want to be a counselor, right? And it's one of the reasons why I didn't want to do this in the first place, was because I'd see people who had a year or two of sobriety at a meeting and they'd raise their hand and they were getting their degree and as an addictions counselor, and I would listen to them and I'd go, no thanks, right? So going back to the listening session, from the stuff you guys heard, what were some of the concerns or some of the comments that were raised by the people in the audience?
I think one of the biggest overall themes was lived experience as a requirement as a recovery coach. I think that is key to what recovery coaching is, in my opinion, from my understanding of it, and coming from I worked as a peer specialist before I worked as a recovery coach. Requirement of the peer specialist is to have lived experience having received mental health services in the past. So I qualify. I check that box, I don't see why this shouldn't be considered it is a peer job. So that is kind of the dynamic that's expected, and I don't think that's, CCAR says anyone can be a recovery coach. That is their stance on it. I personally disagree with that.
I would agree. I think everybody spoke to that. Just about everybody out of the 15 or so people spoke about lived experience being obviously a huge part of this job and quite possibly a requirement. And then people spoke to supervision being non-clinical. The importance of having a recovery coach supervisor, somebody trained as a recovery coach supervisor, and having it non-clinical. There was even a couple clinicians that spoken about how they now supervise recovery coaches, and they took the supervisors training, and then they were supervising coaches, and then they took the RCA on top of the supervisors training, and that really brought the whole position together for them. It made them see what a recovery coach really was, and it helped them understand and become better supervisors. Yeah. So, that was a big thing people talked about too, was supervision, and also ethics was another. Yeah,
I heard that same comment on a phone call that I was on, that again, that taking the supervisor's position, for example, a clinician taking the recovery coach supervision course or certification or whatever it is. I think it's a 3-day class. And then going back and taking the recovery coach training made a huge difference in their perspective on who they were supervising. Yeah. I mean, I'd like to have a roundtable again, specifically about supervision, because I think there's a lot to get into there. But before I do that, I'm actually going to be taking that myself, and I'm going to be speaking to Jim Billings over at Bridgewell also about that. But maybe you, he, and or Danny and he and I can get together and discuss the different, and Steve for that matter too, since he took the supervision training. One of the things, and I'm going to kind of step in it, but as far as lived experience, because Steve and I have gone back and forth on this, did anyone bring up the question of how much lived experience, as a minimum?
So it has been brought up. I'm not sure if it was spoken to at this listening session, but I know at the last commission meeting that Steve spoke at, both Julia and I think Hanea brought up how it is not a requirement, but it is a suggestion from BSAS, the 2-year. Because they started off, they said at 1 year, I think, originally, when BSAS was doing the trainings, and they
Well, they
realized
wanted 2 years. They
it's-
wanted 2.
it's
at
2
first.
years. It was 2 years for
Yeah.
okay, but yeah. So they've spoken on it, but I don't remember hearing it at the last listening session. No.
Okay.
So,
Danny.
and my thing on the, like, I don't necessarily, it's not a hard and fast rule with me, time or abstinence length with me. I think it's subjective to the person. Someone can walk in, and if I like what I'm hearing from them and seeing, what they're doing is recovery coach, what I want to have in a recovery coach, I'm not going to be like, come back and see me at 2 years, abstinent. That's not, for me, it's more when I sit with you, do I like, what I'm hearing from you, and am I comfortable putting you in a position to help out? And I think, time, there's guys with 20 or 30 years that are miserable, and they're not good to support people as a recovery coach. And there's someone with a year of abstinence that is on fire, killing it, and is much better suited for
Right.
supporting someone. So the hard and fast rule is kind of like 2 years, but there's got to be some wiggle room there. There has to be some gray area in, otherwise you're just going to get people lying to you as well.
Well, and I would tend to this might surprise Steve, but I would tend to agree with you on that, and I think it is a case by case basis. The issue that I'm seeing as a potential issue is that there is now empirical evidence that a 5-year length of sobriety does lean more towards the ability to sustain longer term recovery, right? And that it does match with a certain amount of stability, right? And these have been studies that they're recent, but up until now, most of the studies they're doing now is just basically confirming what up until now was anecdotal evidence, right? So you have evidence that shows that someone that can sustain a 5-year period of sobriety, their percentage or their chance of remaining sober for a longer period of time is exponential.
All right. So you said sobriety, but what is recovery? Like, so we're recovery coaches, and we're supposed to be like. So are we talking about abstinence, and are we talking about some kind of betterment of your life as far as recovery, like a change, a sustained change in your life? So what is recovery? What is a relapse? Like, now that we're going down this road of you define your own recovery, that's kind of what our position is as recovery coaches.
Right. And
what is a relapse? What is recovery? What is, like, so if I drink on the weekends, did I relapse? Like, is that like, so what are we talking about? So how do you go in and go, I have 5 years recovery, but
I'm smoking pot on the weekends.
I'm smoking PCP 3 times a week and getting, like it's, where's that gray line? Like, when does it become ridiculous to say you're in recovery, you're not in recovery? Like, what?
Well,
what road are we going down here?
And here's the thing, right? And this is the issue that we run into all the time, because we have our own definition of what recovery is and what sobriety is for us, right? And then, as a result, we're not really supposed to impose that on someone, but then again, how can you not, right? Because you're a human being, right? We're not immune from that. And generally, I think what we're supposed to accept anyway is that everyone defines their own recovery, and there's even kind of a squishy definition of what sobriety is. I mean, I fall back on my favorite, which was a 14th century definition of sober, which is reduced to a quiet condition. So, that you could be reduced to a quiet condition doing heroin on the weekends too. But
I don't disagree with you, but I think when somebody's hiring you, I mean, obviously they can kind of impose, they can figure it out on their own, So I might think I'm sober going in there or in recovery, and they might look at me and go, you're a absolute basket case.
Right, but
I'm not hiring you. You know,
and it's an individual standard too.
Yeah.
The other issue that I do want to bring up and is this whole idea of while Danny was talking, Dennis showed me a job description on his phone that basically was requiring 5 years of sobriety. Right,
as a coach,
right.
as a coach, as a recovery coach.
But here's
nonsense.
Why?
Because it's such an arbitrary number, like 5 years.
Well,
year,
according to empirical evidence now,
so
it's not.
You
not
talk
so much
about
arbitrary.
empirical evidence. I've not seen these numbers.
I've seen it. It says the rate of relapse is greatly reduced after 5 years.
The rate of relapse is reduced at 18 months. The rate of relapse is at 24 months, and every 6 months thereafter, it goes down. So if you haven't, if you stop using drugs and alcohol, you won't be hurting people as much. But if you haven't done anything to change your belief systems, the way that you view the world, the way that you interact with other people, it doesn't matter how much time you have. What are you going to bring at 5 years if you haven't changed who you are, everything about yourself, right? Like,
I agree.
I just think this putting this arbitrary number on the last time that somebody used
hold
drugs.
on, Steve, because you keep saying arbitrary, but it's not arbitrary.
Yes, it is.
There's evidence that there's an exponential rise in a length of maintaining sobriety after 5 years. That 5 years has been a pretty good point of demarcation. So, I mean, the thing is too is you could put it in terms of practicing a sport or a game. If you're practicing pitching a baseball every day and you do it for 2 years or you do it for 5, at what point are you going to be better at
representation?
What makes you a better pitcher?
Representation.
Well, I mean, I'm saying.
You can blow your arm out after 3 years, and then how great are you?
Yeah, exactly.
So, hey, here's my thing of that. At 5 years sober, I was suicidal, not in a good place, and was back in the hospital at 5 years sober.
Right.
So because I had stopped doing the work, I got, quote unquote, you want to say dry. I kind of started, I was, really young in sobriety. I got sober at 19, so I was, in a bad place emotionally and stopped doing the things that work for me, So, like, for me, the time thing is kind of like, all right, 5 years sober, yeah, but I could be 5 years sober, but completely not taking care of myself.
Yeah, and also, I mean, I'm not trying to get adversarial here, and we don't need to either. I'm saying that obviously organizations are looking for a certain thing, and apparently, that's a very important word in this discussion. Apparently, there's evidence and studies that are showing that that's where they're going. So these organizations that are quote unquote requiring or suggesting or wanting preferring a certain amount of sobriety or getting it from somewhere, right? So it's not entirely arbitrary. The other problem that I think we should talk about too is this whole idea of even asking someone whether or not they're sober or in recovery raises a lot of issues for human resources departments because it's not really a question you can ask someone.
So at the Moore meeting yesterday, there was a guy, an EAP guy from the local 25, and he was talking about how much trouble they're having because his union, they have, there's a lot of guys that drive truck and operate heavy machinery, have CDLs, so they're kind of required. They can't really be on MAT to have a CDL. So, like, there's all kinds of gray area that he's stepping into as far as his work is and them being sober or in recovery, like all this stuff. He said that he's finding guys walking around with Suboxone, like that type of deal. How people just take Suboxone on the street, So he's coming into it a lot on his job, and he's an AAP, and he came to that meeting basically just kind of to
throw his hands up in the air.
Just yes. He's like, what the hell more can I do? Like, what can I fight?
My Teamsters are jammed.
They're talking about bringing a recovery coach onto the union because to work with guys that are not quite going into program or detox or anything like that are trying to maintain their life and their work life and things like that, and he's struggling with them because he doesn't know what to tell them because they're all trying to get on, MAT and things like that. And in that job specifically, that's because of the CDL and things like that, it becomes a problem. Where in like another job, being on MAT might not be that big of a deal to your human resource, your people that are hiring.
Did he talk about it all? How he asks or he approaches the question?
I don't think he did. Not too much. No.
So he talked about specifically how they can steer. They might not steer. I don't know how, or suggest their guys can only utilize within their licenses of CDLs can utilize non-addictive MAT. So basically, Vivitrol is kind of pretty much what he said was their employee, that local can, if they want to keep their licenses and keep working, they couldn't be on Suboxone and be working.
Right. Okay.
The controlled meds.
Yeah, controlled substances due to federal regulations or whatnot. So that's a tough dance because lots of medical professionals now are saying Suboxone is the gold standard of MAT, right?
Mm-hmm. Lots.
But then you have, half the workforce that are driving, and, middle America, they can't use that medication. So what are we doing here?
Well, and Steve, you had talked to someone actually about employment law and some of the regulations around the ADA, the American Disabilities Act, right?
Yes.
So what was how did that go?
So the sense, it's basically when we're going into these job interviews, right? So we're already putting ourselves at risk by maybe not straightforwardly admitting that we're drug addicts or ex-drug addicts, but drug addiction is a disease that's protected by the American with Disabilities Act. So therefore, an employer can't ask you certain questions which may lead to discrimination down the road, right? So they can't ask you, how long have you been sober? When's the last time you used?
How many meetings are you going to?
Yeah, what your self-care is. They're really not supposed to ask you that stuff, right? But the sense that I got from conversations I've heard with people up at, higher up in BSAS is that, since we're asking you to reveal parts of yourself, that this is a part of the job, it's going to be okay for them to ask you, what, those questions. So if it was any other job and if it was any other sort of work, yes, I mean there would be lawsuits abound. But yeah, I mean the sense that I get is that there's a whole lot of gray area, and every organization has left themselves wide open for lawsuits. Right?
I think I'm okay with it though. Like if people are asking, I'm not too much, but I think because of the reasons I just think the people we're dealing with, and so if we are in recovery and we are not doing so good, if we relapse or whatever, how good are we to the people that we're serving?
I'm just saying on a regular basis, right? If let's say I'm your supervisor and you come in one day and you're kind of in a pissy little mood, and I go, oh, looks like someone needs a meeting.
Yeah.
Well,
right? I mean that's
or the
not
thing that happened with you.
I mean that's kind of that is
the conversation you had with somebody about, I can't believe you stayed sober through that, right? Like,
yeah.
Think little shots like that where it may not be intentionally said to cause harm, but it perpetuates this idea that
we're fragile and easily triggered.
Fragile, easily triggered, and that we were really hired for our drug addiction.
And I think if they're using it against you,
yeah,
like that, like in a petty way, or throwing digs at you and using it outside of supervision, especially if they're saying that just in the regular work area, like if you're just talking at lunch or something and they say something like that, I think that is a different story. So
let me just clarify what Steve was referring to. Is I was in a therapist office and I was talking about how my dad had died a couple of years ago, and it was sudden, it was quick, and the first thing out of his mouth, his first reaction was, wow, it's amazing you didn't drink, and I was almost 10 years sober at the time, right? So there's definitely a lack of understanding in the clinical community. Now, I mean, the thing is that I'm not saying I had a choice, but I could get pissed off at that, or I actually walked out, and then I went back and I talked to him a couple days later to just because it occurred. There's a bubble, right? And the bubble that most clinicians see are people that are constantly relapsing in and out of the hospital. They see them the first 6 months to a year. They don't see long-term sobriety. So it's easy to have that impression that people don't stay sober, right? Yeah. I mean, I go to meetings, I see, 80 people in the room that are 30, 40 years sober.
Long-term sobriety.
Right.
Yeah.
So I think it's a question of perspective. And if you look at anything that's been written about recovery coaching or discussed about recovery coaching, there's this idea that we're kind of agents of change, right? That we're part of our job description is also to edify and educate and change the perception and advocate for
break down stigma,
right?
Things like that.
Yeah, remove barriers. One of my favorite terms. So let's go back to the listening session, unless anyone has something to add around the ADA and stigma. And
I mean, it sets the precedent from the interview on, right? If you allow people to ask you questions that cross that boundary, it's going to continue on into the job. So I think the education, we have an important job to educate. And I had an experience yesterday where I was talking with a social worker, and I shared something about people doing this job having trauma in the system, right? And she never even considered it because she has, all she sees is the other side. And that one-on-one interaction and the fact that she listened to me and she understood and she's like, wow, I never even considered that. It shows that there is some hope. So I'm hopeful.
Okay. Danny, do you have something to add or?
No, I think the whole thing with hiring coaches and kind of I think there's a like we said, there's a gray area in how you can ask stuff and word stuff, and it's on the it's what you're comfortable with. I'm not I'm not sitting there with a checklist like, all right, goes to 7 meetings a week.
You're saying as a supervisor, right?
Or a prospective employer when I'm interviewing someone.
No, but I think the bigger question is that if that's going to be a requirement, right? Here's my issue with this. If that's going to be a requirement and people are going to put it into a job description as a requirement, and the ADA protects people who are in recovery from being asked that question and tracked, then is it appropriate in that role, according to at least an HR department, as to whether or not those questions can be asked? Because, I mean, as you know, as all of us know, there's going to be a point where someone takes advantage of this and there's a lawsuit, right? And then things are going to change. And taking care of this proactively doesn't seem to be something anyone wants to do.
So what I do in an interview for someone when I'm interviewing a prospective recovery coach is I talk about, are you comfortable sharing your lived experience with people on probably a regular basis, because that is something that can happen for a recovery coach and is appropriate when the time is right with the person. It's not like you have to tell them your recovery story every single time you sit with them or just the first time. It's an organic process, but are you comfortable sharing that stuff, and are you comfortable telling me a little bit about what your recovery looked like and how you got there? That's pretty much it. What they tell me is on them, but I don't get into specifics in terms of how much time they have, in terms of go from there. And then it's on that person to decide what they're comfortable sharing and not sharing as an employee, Leave it open-ended.
Right, and I think that's the strategy that a lot of people are taking, is that they're allowing people to just kind of say what they have to say without actually asking the questions, right? And I think it's pretty much assumed that if you're going for a recovery coach job and you have recovery, right, you're going to talk about it. Because when I was interviewing, I generally thought that would be a bonus, right, that I'm in recovery, so I was the one that brought it up. It was never actually, I don't think it was ever asked. But going forward in the job, there are certain protections under the law that are going to make this difficult, and I think they need to be addressed either through releases or changing things with employment law, at least around people who are employed to use lived experience. I mean, that was the response I got back from someone, relatively highly placed, was, I don't care. That's part of the job, and if you're not going to talk about your recovery, then you shouldn't be doing this job. And my response to her was, we're all former drug addicts and drunks, and we're going to manipulate the system, and someone's going to take advantage of this, and there's going to be a lawsuit, and then we're going to see how much you don't care.
And I think it's not about talking about it's about, can they ask? Like, I think that's what we were talking
exactly.
about. So it's not about me talking about it. It's about, can they ask?
Right.
And I think that's the...
And I wonder if there's any precedent already been set with the peer world. There's been peer specialists
all over this country for a long time.
Since the 70s, and if not earlier. So I wonder if that's already been kind of set, and I'm just not aware of it. I haven't...
Right, like questions like, are you taking your meds?
Yeah.
Right.
So
Yeah.
I don't know, I'm sure that's come up, and, as a mental health, someone who worked as a certified peer specialist, and there are lots of certifications around the country that have had peer specialists for a while. I wonder if that has come up where, say, a coach went out, a peer went off their meds, and the employer asked them specifically, "Hey, are you taking your meds?" And
Bang,
lawsuit.
1-800-LAWYER.
Yeah.
Right. All right. So let's get back to the listening session and what was going on with that. We covered a couple things of some issues that were raised. Were there anything else that stood out, or how about anything you wish had been raised? Whoa. He went up about
Welcome
2 octaves.
to the party, Danny.
Exactly.
That's right.
Went up a couple octaves on that.
I mean, I'm going into all of these with a set agenda of 2 points I'm trying to make each time, differently from the last one, just because there are certain things that I want to get across and share my own personal opinion. This time, my 2 things were, what's the difference between me being certified and licensing? They haven't discussed that at either of the commission meetings, specifically what that will do besides who I write a check to, right? And what that will do for me, because I have 2 roles. So I'm working as a recovery coach on the weekends, but I'm hiring and supervising coaches on Monday through Friday, right? 2 different companies, 2 different jobs, right? What does me being licensed as a recovery coach do for me and do for the employer?
So are you asking, having a career path and a career ladder set up for people that are doing this work?
So I think that certification process already has that started, right?
Right.
But what does the state taking over and jumping in and doing licensing change in terms of, besides me cutting a check, right? What protections does it afford me as an employer and as an employee, right? Those are 2 different things. What protections? And does that then create, I can go to the certification board and say, hey, does this person have their certification? I got a resume of a guy who said he was certified. Guess what? He's not. Not in the state of Massachusetts. I can do that now, and you're not certified. I know that. What's that? If I call, the certification board and said, this guy's getting high with his recoveries, right? Are you gonna pull his cark?
Good point.
And you're saying in terms of a license, they could.
I don't know. That's what I want to hear.
Right. It would depend. It would depend on what the stipulations were to maintain that license, I guess, right?
That's what I want to hear from the commission, is how that will look and what that would do for potential licensed recovery coaches, and what difference will it make. But the reality is, so someone said, what difference will it make? Well, the state can dictate based on their funding whether you have to be a licensed coach. Right? So if they dictate saying you have to have recovery coaches, so there's mandates within contracts that say you have to have recovery coaches on teams, right?
Yep.
That's public money. So that's state money. So they can dictate you need to have licensed coaches on there, right? So they can
And not only license, but there could be potential tiers of licensure, right? So there's like, with social workers with LCSW and LICSW, they could have that with this. And I think that was one thing that I know I brought up in 2017 when I was doing the supervisors training with Tulani. And we were talking about, a lot of people that come out, myself included at the time, I just had a high school diploma. Right. So, like, are we going to throw up some more educational barriers for people that don't even have a high school diploma? So why would we want to put these different tiers into the process? You know what I'm saying? Like, why should you have to have a bachelor's degree and be a higher tier than somebody that just has a certification with only a high school diploma? Right. So, anyways, that's one of my biggest concerns.
Do you guys see it going in that direction?
Potentially. I see them looking at it. I don't know if there's...
That's passion right there. That was a loud potentially.
Blew my eardrums out.
So I think it's anything's possible. We don't know. And the other reality about this commission is there could be a ton of recommendations.
And nothing happened.
And the governor could look at it and say, thanks, but no thanks.
Well, which might not be a bad thing.
And that happened. That happened with the quarry reform, right?
Yeah,
we know
that's
that.
what they said. Yeah, they said that they did the whole commission. Moore told us because they were heavily involved in the quarry reform panel. And
can you explain that?
Well, they had a whole, just like they have this commission now for recovery coaching, MAT, all that stuff. They had a similar one for quarry reform. They went through the whole process of the commission. At the end, there was like no recommendations made. Nothing changed. And then they went to Moore and said, hey, what do you like? Can you come up with some recommendations for us that we can give the governor? Like something like that. So Moore had to come up with all this.
Well, I guess my question was more around what exactly was what in the quarry were they trying to reform?
So I think they ended up changing the
it was 10 years
time
7 years.
that it would come off your record.
Okay.
Like that type of stuff for like employment and things like that.
Okay.
So so that type.
So when you do a search on a criminal record, that it.
Yeah. So instead of 10 years for a felony or whatever it it's like 7 now.
Okay.
That type of that type of change that they did.
Right, and different organizations too are changing the rules as far as recovery coaches go too to be a little pay less attention to a criminal record when hiring someone too, right? That's been mostly internal.
Yeah, and I would think that, just like we have substance, we like a lot of us have lived experience. I think part of that lived experience is obviously a criminal background for a lot of us.
Right.
Danny.
Only been in a cop car once and was brought home
by choice.
I've only been to jail for 2 weeks, so and it was county. So
that only leaves 2 of us, Steve.
Don't look at me,
Steve. You can hear Steve's story on episode 2, where he talks all about that. Any fears you guys have about the commission?
My fear is that, like Dennis was talking about, nothing changes, and then they go to one organization and have all the input. I don't think that's going to happen because I was actually surprised about how many people showed up to that down in Fall River.
Pleasantly surprised, or?
I'm rarely pleasantly surprised, but I was surprised.
Horribly.
I was surprised. Yeah, there was a lot of people representing that part of the state.
Yes,
which was cool.
And I think when they asked how many recovery coaches like almost 80% of the room put their hands up.
I would say 90%.
Yeah, and I think this commission specifically, there's a lot of attention on it, and there's a lot of activity from people like us showing up at these things, like Steve was saying. There's a lot of people that are doing the work that are paying attention to what they're doing, and sending in letters or sending in emails to them saying, we think you guys screwed up on the selection process. You have nobody on there with lived experience, or that type of stuff. Telling them that, like, hey, we're watching you, and we know it's a political process, but like, don't F this up.
Do you think that's coming from individuals or from organizations like Moore and things like that?
Both.
Really?
So I think Moore is asking individuals to take part in their process. But then I think outside of that, there's also a lot of there are different organizations like MORE across the state that are doing similar things in their regions and getting people together, like organized and sending in letters and emails and things like that. So I think yes, it's a both. So I think organizations are bringing people together, having them doing it in a group like we do at MORE, sending in a letter with like maybe all of us on it, and then asking us separately to go out to our peers, people we work with, or just whatever, to say, hey, you guys, if you want to get involved and you can't make the meetings or whatever, send in emails, send in your complaints, whatever, as a private citizen, that works in the field, that is concerned about what's going on with, this coaching commission and stuff like that. So
was there any feedback about that from the commission? Like saying that they had heard from a lot of people?
So they have said that definitely that, like, out of all the commissions, the room was the most full for like.
So they are noticing.
Yeah, they are absolutely,
That's
and how we're like active and So they have definitely said, the commission has said that, and they've said it to like MORE also. So when we go to these MORE meetings, MORE will say, they're definitely noticing that you guys are there and paying attention.
I think one of the biggest feedback things was there were some issues with some of the appointments onto the commission. And they got phone calls from angry constituents about that. And they heard that. And kind of there wasn't much transparency on how they chose members of that commission. And that was brought up, and they kind of recognized that and asked for more feedback on that. And there's more of a process now.
And then they did try to do better with the panel. So the panel that Steve was on and spoke at, there was more of a like nomination process for that, where people could go, hey, I think this person should be heard from. So I think they heard that they
I understand
probably didn't do it the best way.
I've been on an email chain where there's a nomination process supposedly now for someone else to be on the commission, right? Because they lost someone. And no one can seem to find the link of where you fill out the form to be able to.
So
because
I'm not sure
it's
not for the commission. That position that is now vacant, they're going to do that nomination internally. Like they're going to probably pick from the people they already have.
And they're also going to reach out to organizations.
Yeah, and so what they're looking for now, there's going to be another panel coming up, a couple panels coming up. One's for people that employers, and then what else? Organizations, was it?
I believe it was consumers.
I don't know, but there's two more panels coming up, and they're going to be having kind of like nomination processes for those where we can send in.
You can nominate someone that's an employer.
You can go, hey, I think Richard Zombeck should get up there and speak or whatever.
Yeah, I don't think anyone thinks that.
I know, but I was just I was staring into your eyes and I couldn't help.
It's infectious, isn't it?
Yes, it is.
So I kind of want to throw this out to all of you. Feel free to pass if you want, but let's assume that the people on the commission and Mary Lou Setters and Charlie Baker are going to listen to this podcast. Is there anything you'd want them to know?
That's a loaded question.
Okay, well we can all pass.
No, I don't think it's I think it's more.
That's a hard one to answer within.
Yeah, it's hard to like. What do I want? Let us do our job, how we're trained, and don't muck it up with over clinicalization of what we do. Yeah, let us work human to human.
Yeah.
Right? Let us support the people. Granted, I understand there's a need for documentation and proving what we're doing, it works, right? But don't make it so overly complicated that you lose the value of me sitting with another guy and saying, been there, man. How can I help you get through it? I'm here for you. Let's walk this path together. Plain and simple.
Yeah, don't have
don't louse this thing up.
Sure.
Yeah, and there are a number of ways that could happen. That's I saw that at that commission, that when you guys mentioned the commission where Steve was on the panel, and that question of what's the difference between a sponsor and how is a recovery coach different than a sponsor? Right?
That was posed by Governor Baker himself to somebody. That's how that question kind of came up.
And the first thing you got to say is, like, sponsors 12-step only based recovery. That's only one single pathway to
Well,
recovery.
well, not
a recovery. A recovery coach is open and supporting all pathways to recovery, right? So I'm not a sponsor.
And a sponsor doesn't have the backing of the whatever organization.
Exactly.
They work for.
I think, and Steve and I have talked about this, which is probably one of the points why I brought it up, because you listen to people respond to this and they don't really have an answer because the easy answer is to say they're not, because for some reason people think there's something wrong with a sponsor, right? But and I'm not saying the people in this room. I'm saying that you pose a question like that, and the immediate reaction of the person getting that question is that I have to find a difference. And the whole thing is that the Recovery Coach program was born from sponsorship and peer-to-peer and one person helping another, right? So the real difference is that there's very little difference as far as the human contact goes. If you want to say that a sponsor is only 12-step, I would disagree with that, but that's an entirely different story. Wow. But like Steve pointed out, you're essentially a peer that has the full backing of the organization for which you work, right? So, like in the case of me and Steve, we have social workers available to us. I don't know. We have medical doctors available to us.
I think a sponsor, though, I think there is a certain power dynamic with the sponsor. And
I would agree with that.
So I think to say you're just a peer, I think that's a little different. And I do think with sponsorship, they're obviously very similar. Like, there's no denying that there's obvious similarities with sponsorship and, recovery coach and peer work. But I think sponsorship, most solutions you get from a sponsor are abstinent-based and 12-step-based. And I think that's how it should be. That's how, a sponsor shouldn't be like a counselor or a life coach, like, in my opinion. It's more around the steps and, that type of recovery stuff. And that's similar to coaching, but I think most of the solutions you'll hear from a sponsor is about abstinence or the 12 steps, or, hey, you're having this problem, do more 4-step work, or, pray more, or, things like that. And I'm not sure that's what we do as recovery coaches. So I think, to me, that's one of the big differences, and I think it's not a peer. I don't think it's a peer role. I think there is a power dynamic with sponsorship.
I've heard dozens of explanations to that question, and I think that's probably the best one I've heard yet. So thank you.
Thank you.
Well done.
Did that hurt you to say that?
Yes, it did.
It did.
Absolutely.
A little bit. I cried a little bit, and I'll probably be in a.
That's going to get cut.
I'll be in a fetal position later today.
That's definitely getting cut out.
So that's probably we're coming up on an hour. That's probably a good a time as any to wrap this up, unless you guys have something else you'd like to add.
No, we can always do it again.
No, we can do this roundtable again.
That's what I'm saying. I like to keep it in an hour, and we'll meet back again, and we'll do on another topic. So again, you've wasted a completely good hour with Buds with Suds, and I am Richard Zombek, and I'm here with my co-host Steve Lesnikowski. We'd like to thank Danny Ginivan and Dennis Doris for coming in and doing this on a Saturday afternoon. Again, you can check us out on budswithsuds.com and check us on iTunes, subscribe to the podcast, and rate us, and leave a comment if you can. And again, at the website, you can also find all of our links to Facebook, Twitter, and the rest of the
YouTube, Spotify,
interwebs.
Thank you. Keep up the good work, guys.